CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Zimbabwe is on edge since the National Defense Army took control of the country in what they termed as not a military takeover. But Mugabe refuses to budge, insisting that he is still the country's legitimate leader. So coup or no coup? With more internal voices demanding for him to resign, will this be the end of his 37-year rule? And as regional mediators descend on the capital, Harare, to broker the situation, how soon will the country return to normalcy? And what next for Zimbabwe in these uncertain times? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Robert Gabriel Mugabe, the man who has dominated Zimbabwe's politics for close to 4 decades. Renowned for his often bold style of confronting global issues, Mugabe has characteristically been vocal on issues of African sovereignty and its self-determination, climate change and global peace. However, his radical land reforms in the 80s and 90s put him in the crosshairs of the Western world. And ever since, Zimbabwe has also dealt with multiple crises, including crippling economic sanctions, world record inflation levels, and dire humanitarian situations. And as the continent and the world remain on edge as to Zimbabwe's future, we now take a look at Mugabe and Zimbabwe through the years.
A brilliant mind, a ruthless politician, and a way with words that made the whole world listen.
Neither Bush nor Blair can bring about regime change here. Never. We'll never accept it.
However much the years aged Robert Mugabe, the sheer power of his character has never faded. And whatever his critics may say, for this day alone, Zimbabwe's independence, Mugabe earned his right to be counted among the icons of Africa's liberation era.
This is a great moment. It's a moment of our victory, the culmination of our national struggle.
Born in 1924, Robert Gabriel Mugabe looked destined for life in the classroom. But his education brought a taste for the principles of basic human rights and revolutionary fervor. He became a key character in the fight against white rule. Once that fight was won, Mugabe offered peace with some honor to the white minority and pursued policies that won him global acclaim, even a knighthood. Land reform was always going to be difficult, and when Mugabe pursued a far more aggressive approach to redistributing land, former supporters outside Zimbabwe turned on him. Mugabe remained defiant.
The issue of our sovereignty, the issue of our land, is not negotiable. Our resources, let those who come negotiate with us to participate in our resources. But our gold is ours. Our platinum belongs to us. Our diamonds are ours. They are not American, they are not British.
But the economy collapsed in those dark years. Staging a recovery only after regional leaders forced Mugabe to form a government of national unity in 2008. Africa's former breadbasket even now remains a shadow of what it had been, forced in recent years to import to stave off a food crisis. Mugabe's popularity at home remained undiminished. For many, his message was just as compelling as it had been during the struggle.
There will never be a regime change here. There will always be the people of Zimbabwe in control.
He swept to a convincing election victory in 2013. He led the African Union through 2015. And just recently, his party endorsed Mugabe to run again in the next elections.
What the Zimbabwe Defense Forces is doing.
But the dramatic events in Harare begs the question, what now for Africa's longest-serving leader? Jane Keo, CGTN.
Now, CGTN's correspondent in Zimbabwe, Farai Mwakutuya, has been closely monitoring events from the capital, Harare. He now brings us up to speed on the circumstances leading up to the Southern African nation's current state of affairs.
by virtue of the authority vested in me.
After 3 days of confinement as an unprecedented political crisis played out, Zimbabwe's embattled President Robert Mugabe was seen for the first time in public on Friday, officiating a university graduation ceremony. Earlier, the country's military said it had partially completed its mission to account for criminals surrounding President Mugabe. Talks between the veteran leader and military chiefs were deadlocked after a Thursday afternoon meeting with South African mediators. The stalled diplomatic effort has heightened anxiety in a nation that's looking for a quick resolution to a dramatic political crisis.
We are saying we are giving a warning, a very stark warning to Mugabe, to his wife, and to anybody who still wants to be associated with him, that the game is up, finished, done. We won't allow this to go any further. We are giving an ultimatum to Mugabe. This aura of this pretense that things are normal, going to Zou University and keeping people, hey, it's pretense. We won't accept it. It's finished. He has to make a decision along the diplomacy which is being given by SADC to promptly leave office. That's all we want.
The veterans have organized a march on Saturday to compel Mugabe to step down. On Friday, the ruling ZANU-PF party initiated a process to recall the president. All of the party's provincial structures passed a vote of no confidence in the embattled leader and his wife, First Lady Grace Mugabe, and called for the reinstatement of former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Well, let's delve more into this discussion, and I'm now joined by an expert panel of guests to help us break down developments in the Zimbabwean crisis. In Johannesburg, Dr. David Monyae, he's a co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. In Beijing, Professor Ho Wenping, she's a senior research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. To you both, thank you for joining us on Talk Africa today. Dr. Monyae, you're a neighbor there in South Africa. First, to you though, events are continuing to unfold in Zimbabwe, but the army says that they took the decision they did so as to address the political, social and economic suffering of the people. First of all, did these events come as a surprise at all?
Not at all. I think the making of the coup has been going on for quite some time. I think for those who trained eye could see clear signals in Harare that something is brewing, as well as the fact that President Robert Mugabe had made numerous miscalculations in terms of moving away from the script of having his former vice president as his successor and choosing his wife. And the manner in which he did it, it threatened the well-being of well-established forces, particularly the military and all other important key and strategic places. And therefore, for their own survival, they had to do something in terms of preventing an incoming faction within ZANU-PF.
Well, Dr. Monyae, I just want to jump in there briefly and ask you, because the army has said what happened, what took place is not a military coup, is not a coup. What are your thoughts?
What happened is that the military is in full control. President Robert Mugabe has been confined to the house, other than what happened for the reasons that a delegation coming from South Africa had to conduct business with him, and therefore the State House was an ideal place to do business of the state. And the military is keen to show to the world that President Robert Mugabe remains the president. However, they are awaiting his formal resignation. So all this has to be done in a more respectful way and without really triggering the terrible term, which is a military coup. Right. No one wants that. That will bring the international community.
Let's hear what the international community thought of this. Professor Ho Wenping, you're watching this from China, of course, and China has had a long history of economic and political relations with Zimbabwe. Has this come as a surprise?
Of course, I think this is such a sudden thing happening it's a surprise at all. But when we trace back to the history of the Zimbabwe, especially in the recent years, I think it's not surprise because those inside this struggle for power within the ruling party has been a story in the recent at least 10 years also. But from the perspective of China, and I think, of course, this is the internal things in Zimbabwe.
Right.
I don't think like somebody saying, oh, because Robert Mugabe himself is the long-term friend for China, and then it seems like all of a sudden, seems China now is in some, you know, the down hand. I don't think that way. Our friendship with Zimbabwe is not only based on with just one person or one leadership. It's based on with this country as a whole, with the ruling party as a whole, with the people as a whole. Because what we have is what the Zimbabwe needs. So that's the thing bound us together, closer and very solid.
Dr. Munyai, though, there were some social and economic situations that have brought Zimbabwe to where it is today. What is the current state of Zimbabwe's political and social situation that may have contributed immensely to the turn of events?
The situation, both political and economic situation, is worsening by the day. As you are aware, Zimbabwe does not even have a credible currency, relies on foreign currencies, the South African rand, the yuan, the Chinese yuan, as well as the US dollar. Unemployment is reaching in the state of 80 to 90%, and massive exodus of Zimbabweans to neighboring countries, mainly in South Africa. And most companies are closing shop. And Zimbabwe is continuously relying on informal economy, people trading on the ground. But when it comes to economic policy, there is no clear economic policies. Foreign investors are not coming in big numbers, and therefore moving at this stage with President Robert Mugabe, I think something had to give in, and therefore one is not surprised that this situation that we are in, it was necessitated by all these conditions on the ground.
Right. Professor Howeng-Ping, though, there's been some speculation that perhaps there was some international influence in the ongoings in Zimbabwe. What do we know as a matter of fact? Was there any international intervention in this case? Are there any foreign powers that may have influenced the decisions that took place in Zimbabwe?
Of course, we have already heard a lot of international concern now relates with this event in Zimbabwe. For example, President Zuma of South Africa has already sent a special envoy and a delegation with the high levels leaderships now visiting Zimbabwe and meet President Robert Mugabe and trying to negotiate a way out, how to resolve this crisis in a very peaceful way. Now we also heard like SADC, the regional bloc, also show their concern, and even the AU. So they also show they need to see a peaceful resolution. This is China's concern as well. We wish all these crises can be resolved in a negotiable way, a peaceful way. So we are very happy to see a lot of people there. The people there, they still enjoy the normal life. They go to the office and they go to school, so which is very good. And now we also heard lots of different parties, like opposition parties, Changrale, like a former opposition party leader, and also the former deputy president, like Mujuri. They all come out and put forward their wish to establish a coalition, interim government, which is a good thing.
Right. Dr. Munyai, I do want to come back to what Professor Howeng-Ping has mentioned there, because from the African point of view, of course, there have been some strong statements against what we may call coups on the continent, but there are some Western countries who have perhaps wanted a regime change in Zimbabwe. Why is there such division when it comes to a way forward for Zimbabwe?
I think what we're seeing is that is convergence of interest in Zimbabwe as the military coup. What is surprising is that the views coming from the ground civil society, the opposition, seem to indirectly support the coup, as well at SADC level. There is hesitant to call it a coup, so therefore the discussions are to deal with the situation, to resolve in a peaceful manner. And the international community itself, there's always been a need for a regime change in Zimbabwe, led by Western powers. But what is happening is a different kind of regime change. It's a regime change similar to what happens in so many places in political parties, particularly, I mean, you had Labour, Blair being taken by Brown. In South Africa, you had President Mbeki being taken by current President Jacob Zuma. And in ZANU-PF, it's more or less similar. However, the difference is that the military is directly involved. That's what makes this kind of a regime change differ from what's happening in Britain and South Africa.
Right. Dr. Munyai and Professor Howeng Ping do stay with us for the moment, because we're going to take a short break now. But when we come back, we'll assess further the unfolding situation in Zimbabwe. Do stay with us.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
There are developments in Zimbabwe that are ongoing. I think anyone who makes a very tight conclusion as to what is going to happen in Zimbabwe will be a kind of a politician who does not calculate. Because you don't want to speculate. You want to see what is happening and take the appropriate kind of conclusion and decision. And I think it would be too early to take any firm decision now. I'm sure that the situation in Zimbabwe very shortly will be becoming clear.
That was South African President Jacob Zuma addressing Parliament on the developing situation in neighboring Zimbabwe, where he highlighted precaution in assessing the matter of Zimbabwe. I still have my expert guest standing by in Johannesburg, Dr. David Munyai, co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. In Beijing, Professor Howeng Ping, senior research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And joining me now in Nairobi is Professor Michael Chege. He's a lecturer of public and international development at the University of Nairobi. Thank you for joining us on the program. Professor Chege, let me start off with you first, because you've been watching this from a little bit further afield in East Africa. What are your thoughts on the unraveling situation in Zimbabwe?
The unraveling situation in Zimbabwe is one that should concern all of us as Africans, because Zimbabwe is one of the most important countries politically and culturally and economically in our continent. It has been going through a difficult economic and political crisis in the last 2 decades, I think, and everybody has been wanting some change. It seems to be coming, but we all at the end of our nerves, because we want it to be done. We wanted to make this transition and make it well, so that the continent can be proud of a good and peaceful and productive transition.
Let's look at that transition for the moment, because Dr. Munyai, you're watching it there. What do we know about the roadmap and the transition post-military takeover?
I think what is going to happen is more likely to be a cooling off phase in Zimbabwe, in which the governing party needs cooling off to deal with the crisis. And let us not forget, this crisis is mainly a ZANU-PF crisis. And they need to buy time to have a new person to lead the party, and to buy time in terms of the future elections and the survival of ZANU-PF. But you also need a cooling time for Zimbabwe as a whole to stabilize, to have better economic policy and good policy making, as well as practice in terms of the cabinet itself. the selections of individuals to run that with the blessing of the opposition in that government. And you also need a stabilization and restart, re-engagement of Zimbabwe with the international community, mainly the former colonial power, Britain, United States, to ensure that all sanctions are lifted, and also to continue on the good path with China in terms of further investments by the Chinese in Zimbabwean economy. And all of the above would then give Zimbabwe confidence, those who had left the country to come back, and to have Zimbabwe back as a normal country, joining the family of nations in the world.
Right. Professor Hoang Ping, in terms of re-engagement, what would Zimbabwe, though, what would China see in Zimbabwe's re-engagement with China and other international partners?
Well, yes, I think Zimbabwe has been isolated with international society for such a long time, which also part of the reason for causing this kind of economic difficulties. I think we wish with this event, maybe that will bring another opportunity, a good chance for this country to engage with international society. Of course, with China's relation, we wish this will bring a further cooperation and to push our relations in a new high. So with those new, like smooth transition of the power, and then, yeah, probably that will also engage with these Western countries as a whole, which is also a good thing for Zimbabwe.
Professor Shege, in terms of re-engagement, because Zimbabwe had huge hyperinflation. It suffered a crisis in 2000, and in 2008, you know, it has had a failing agricultural sector. How much is going to be needed, though, to get Zimbabwe back on track? What will the future look like for Zimbabwe?
Well, if they can get over the political transition, hopefully, with dignity, with due dignity for President Mugabe, considering the role he has played in that country, the first line of engagement is going to bring economic management into steady and tradable environment, and that will require dealing with the currency, that will require dealing with debt, and the first line of engagement to be for this new country, for this new government, will be to deal with the IMF, because without their say-so, it's going to be very difficult for other creditors to come in and forgive debt, and for new money to come in, and that has to happen. They've been talking to the IMF, incidentally, even in the past when Mr. Mugabe was there. That has to happen, so that other creditors can come, and you can get over the hubs, the huge debts they have, the external payments they have to make, and a currency which actually means nothing. All of that will require engagement of international institutions. Next to that, Zimbabwe's largest trading partners now are South Africa and the People's Republic of China. They have to come in because they are owed a lot of money. And you have to have the confidence of companies operating from there, as well as government and banks operating from there, so that they can give this new government a breather.
Right.
So that it can use that opportunity to expand trade and investment to other parts of the world.
But when you look at it, though, with Zimbabwe having a poverty line of about 73% of the population, that turnaround is going to be very tricky. It's going to be very tricky. But until you get the macroeconomic picture acceptable and balanced, it's going to be very difficult to do with that. But the good thing about this transition is that if Zimbabwe can engage the international community well, there is so much goodwill that programs that look at issues of extreme poverty, hunger, lack of access to basic goods, that kind of money is going to be available from the UN, from the World Bank, from other bilateral donors who look well to Zimbabwe. The good thing about poverty in Zimbabwe and overcoming it is that the economy, the basic economy is still intact. The infrastructure is still very good. Electricity is available, although the maintenance is an issue. The agriculture sectors of it are doing well, like tobacco. Right. But they have minerals. There is so much potential in that country, as well as tourism and game parks. It's going to be a very short period of time before Zimbabwe zooms up
and it's going to be one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. And that will help us with the poverty.
Right. Dr. Munyai, of course, this is all hinging on clear transition here, of course, and SADC at the moment is engaged in negotiations here. But SADC is often seen as being a bit lackluster when it comes to trying to find suitable paths for countries within the region. What significant role, though, are we likely to see coming from the African Union, for instance, or from SADC itself in terms of Zimbabwe?
Both SADC and the AU are working on a very tight rope here. I think there's a fear by both institutions to declare what's happening in Zimbabwe as a military coup. And given what is happening, they have no capacity to move if it is a coup. If they declare it a coup, they have no capacity to deal with the Zimbabwe military. And I doubt if there's any SADC country who will have the capacity to intervene militarily in Zimbabwe. And therefore, I think their intervention is to influence the negotiations. They have been on the ground. They've been part of previous transitional arrangements. I think it will be a continuation, but this time around, that continuation will have a bit of a change. One sees Zimbabweans wanting to own the process, and that's one thing that has been lacking in Zimbabwe. Unlike South Africa, the transition in South Africa was led by South Africans. They never had a Lancaster House. They never had any other outside players coming in to influence a settlement in South Africa. Zimbabweans must, this time around, take the opportunity, agree among themselves, and only allow SADC and the AU to give that legitimacy and ensure that all necessary support is given. That will itself attract the international community to re-engage Zimbabwe in a meaningful way.
Right. Professor Howeng Ping, I'm going to get a last comment from you. So, moving forward in terms of Zimbabwe, what do you see? What's going to happen now?
Yeah, Zimbabwe is a great country. I had a chance to visit the country 2 years ago. I think the people there are very peaceful people, and also like even the military, it doesn't have any history for intervening like into the political issue. This is the very first time. So I don't believe like this is going to be like a military coup, like those military persons will grasp the power and not let it go, and they will establish like a military council, something, continue to in charge of all the issues in Zimbabwe. I think they have shown their sincerity right now. They are saying they are going to back to their camp as long as the transition becoming very smooth. So I sincerely hope that this power transition will be peaceful, will be in a very smooth way, and then everything back to the normal, and the country will have a great chance to untap its a great potential.
All right, that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Dr. David Munyai is a co-director of the Confucius Institute at the University of Johannesburg. In Beijing, Professor Howeng Ping, she's a senior research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And with me in Nairobi, Professor Michael Chega, lecturer at the University of Nairobi here in Kenya. And that's all we have time for this week. But remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Bye-bye.